Most illegitimate children in Tudor England were destined for obscurity. A quiet life, perhaps in the countryside, maybe a clerical post or a military role if they were lucky. But Henry FitzRoy was not most children. He was the only acknowledged illegitimate son of King Henry VIII, and for a while it looked like he might become something far greater than history was ever supposed to allow. He was born in 1519 to Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The affair was brief, but the result, a healthy baby boy, became a symbol of everything Henry VIII wanted, a male heir. While Queen Catherine had failed to give Henry a living son, this boy, born outside of marriage, was strong, loud, and clearly of Tudor blood. So the king did something extraordinary. At just 6 years old, FitzRoy was made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, an almost unheard of honor for a child, let alone one born out of wedlock. He was given his own estates, his own household, and servants who bowed to him as if he were already a prince. He wore miniature versions of royal robes. He was educated by top scholars. He received formal greetings from foreign ambassadors. And wherever he went, people whispered the same thing. He looks like the king. Henry VIII didn't just dote on him, he showcased him. In a time when England still had no legitimate male heir, Henry FitzRoy began to seem like a solution. There were rumors, not officially confirmed, but quietly accepted, that the king might legitimize him. He had the power to do it. And with a stroke of the royal pen, FitzRoy could become next in line to the English throne. For a while, everything seemed to be falling into place. The boy was adored, protected, groomed for greatness. At just 14, he was married to Mary Howard, the daughter of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful nobles in the country. It was a political match, but also a symbolic one. FitzRoy was being positioned at the center of power, and it worked. When he walked into a room, grown men bowed. Foreign ambassadors addressed him with careful respect. He wasn't just the king's son, he was the king's favorite. But behind the walls of court, not everyone was celebrating. Some saw FitzRoy as a threat, especially Anne Boleyn, who had just recently become queen and was determined to place her daughter Elizabeth into the line of succession. Others saw danger in the idea of legitimizing an illegitimate son. What precedent would that set? What message would it send? And what would happen if FitzRoy actually lived long enough to become king? But of course, that's not how this story ends. Because while the boy's rise was meteoric, his fall would be something else entirely. And it would come not from a sword, or scandal, or civil war, but from something far colder. Henry FitzRoy was growing into his role. By age 14, he walked the halls of Whitehall with the kind of confidence only one thing could give: unquestioned favor from the king. He didn't have to say a word. Everyone already knew. He was young, handsome, well-dressed, and trained in all the skills of royalty: swordsmanship, languages, diplomacy, theology. He dined with nobles twice his age and was referred to, sometimes openly, as the Shadow Prince. And that shadow? It was starting to fall over the entire Tudor court. For years, Henry VIII had watched queens come and go, but no living son had ever lasted. FitzRoy, though illegitimate, was not just alive, he was thriving. In a dynasty obsessed with male heirs, that made him powerful. Too powerful for some, especially Queen Anne Boleyn. Anne had recently married the king and given birth to Princess Elizabeth. While Elizabeth was the king's legitimate child, she was still a girl, and in the eyes of the 16th century, that meant less security, less power, and far more risk for Anne's own position. FitzRoy represented a very real threat. If Henry ever legitimized him, FitzRoy would leap to the front of the line of succession, above Elizabeth, above any future children Anne might have, and above the dreams of every family that had aligned itself with the Boleyns. In this climate, FitzRoy's marriage to Mary Howard added fuel to the political fire. Mary was no common girl. She was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's own uncle, and her marriage to FitzRoy was a carefully calculated move. Some say it was meant to bind the Boleyn faction to FitzRoy's future rise. Others whisper it was a strategic insurance policy in case Anne fell from favor. But whatever the motive, the match did little to calm the rising tension. The young couple, barely teenagers, became a political symbol. They were part of a silent chess game being played in back rooms, whispered through veils and sealed behind wax. And then there was the question that everyone was too afraid to say aloud. Was the king preparing FitzRoy to be his heir? No one knew for sure, but the signs were there. Henry gave FitzRoy access to confidential briefings. He included him in state ceremonies. He even placed him in charge of military musters in the north, a role typically reserved for adult noblemen with years of experience. Every move the king made seemed to suggest a quiet grooming process, not public, not official, but intentional and dangerous. For nobles loyal to Queen Catherine of Aragon or Queen Anne, FitzRoy's rise was unsettling because Henry was unpredictable, and in Tudor England, favor could become fate. If FitzRoy were named heir, entire power structures would shift overnight. Lands would be reassigned, marriages would be renegotiated, ambitions would be destroyed. He was just a boy, but the shadow he cast was long. Behind closed doors, debates raged. Can a bastard wear a crown? Will the Pope acknowledge him? What if the king dies suddenly? Will FitzRoy be ready? And if not, who will control him? The questions had no answers, and the anxiety grew. Because in a court where secrets killed as often as swords, even the idea of succession was dangerous. Meanwhile, FitzRoy seemed unaware, or perhaps unfazed. He spent his days reading, writing, riding, entertaining dignitaries, and practicing statecraft. He carried himself with composure and rarely spoke out of turn. He was no reckless child, but he was young, and youth, in the Tudor court, was a weakness you didn't always see coming. By the spring of 1536, the political air around FitzRoy had grown thick. Anne Boleyn's position was beginning to slip. Her enemies, both religious and personal, were quietly sharpening their knives. The king's mood was darker, his patience thinner. And FitzRoy? He remained where he always had been, at the center of power, smiling, obedient, trusting, but for the first time, fragile. Because while he had survived the whispers, the alliances, and the ambitions of others, he would not survive what came next. For years, Henry FitzRoy was untouchable. He had power, he had protection, he had the king's blood, and most importantly, the king's affection. But in the summer of 1536, everything changed. Quietly, without warning, and not through scandal or war, but through something far more unstoppable: illness. It began with exhaustion. FitzRoy, usually energetic and active, started complaining of persistent fatigue. He no longer rode with the same enthusiasm. He withdrew from public events. At first, it was thought to be overwork, the pressure of royal expectation finally catching up to a teenage boy. But then the symptoms worsened. He developed a harsh, unrelenting cough. He lost his appetite. his weight began to drop. Some accounts suggest he had trouble breathing. Others describe him as increasingly pale and withdrawn. Whatever it was, his health was deteriorating rapidly. He was just 17 years old. And yet, the boy, once considered for the throne, was fading in real time. Physicians were summoned. Treatments were attempted, herbal infusions, bleeding, prayer, but nothing seemed to help. The official diagnosis? Likely tuberculosis, though the term was not widely used at the time. To modern ears, that may sound clinical, but in Tudor England, it was terrifying. Tuberculosis was slow, cruel, and poorly understood. And worse, it was seen not just as a sickness, but as a judgment. Whispers began to circulate. Was it divine punishment? Had the king's favoritism gone too far? Was this karma for elevating a bastard above his legitimate heirs? Others took a darker turn. Was FitzRoy poisoned? Was this the work of rivals, of Anne Boleyn's faction? Was someone making sure he would never wear a crown? There is no evidence to support these theories, but in Henry VIII's court, evidence was rarely needed. Suspicion was power. Rumor was currency. And by the time FitzRoy was moved to St. James's Palace for rest, everyone had heard the news. The king's only son was dying. And yet, the king did not come. Despite all his previous affection, Henry VIII never visited his son in his final days. Some believe it was grief, that the king couldn't bear to watch his son die. Others argue it was fear, not just of death, but of what it represented. A broken heir, a failed legacy, a crack in the divine image Henry had worked so hard to project. After all, just weeks earlier, Henry had ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn. He had finally cleared the path for a legitimate male heir. And now, the son he once considered king was slipping away. FitzRoy was aware of his condition. That much is clear from the letters and testimonies left behind. He reportedly faced it with grace and quiet resolve, far beyond his years. He asked for his wife, Mary Howard. He prayed, and he waited. On July 23, 1536, Henry FitzRoy died. Just 17. No title, no will, no official last words remembered. No crowds wept, no great bell tolled, no foreign ambassadors were summoned. The boy who was once elevated above dukes and cardinals was gone, without ceremony. But even in death, FitzRoy was still a problem, because no one quite knew what to do with him. When Henry FitzRoy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, died in July 1536, the news traveled quietly, almost suspiciously so. He was the only acknowledged son of Henry VIII. He had carried a royal title. He had once been whispered about as the king's heir. And yet, his death was treated like an inconvenience. There was no royal proclamation, no official mourning period, no national prayers, no black cloth draped across London's cathedrals, not even a state funeral. Instead, he was buried quickly, quietly, almost as if the court wanted to move on before anyone had time to process what had happened. But of course, the silence only raised more questions. To understand the chilling nature of FitzRoy's death, we have to look at what else was unraveling in England that summer. The year was 1536, one of the most tumultuous and violent years in Tudor history. Just 2 months earlier, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, second wife of Henry VIII, and one of FitzRoy's greatest political rivals, had been executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Whether those charges were true remains a matter of debate. What isn't debated is that her death shocked Europe. It also created a vacuum. Anne was gone. Elizabeth, her daughter, had been declared illegitimate, and suddenly FitzRoy stood again as the most obvious candidate to inherit the throne, even if still technically born outside marriage. Except, within weeks, he was dead too. To many, it felt as though fate, or someone, was clearing the board. Anne Boleyn, gone. Henry FitzRoy, gone. 2 threats removed before the king remarried. Coincidence? Likely, convenient, undeniably. But regardless of cause, FitzRoy's death posed a very real political problem. What do you do with the corpse of a boy who once almost became king, but now no longer matters? What happened next was nothing short of eerie. Rather than organizing a royal burial at Westminster or Windsor, as might be expected for someone of FitzRoy's status, his funeral was rushed, muted, and stripped of royal symbolism. No heralds, no great procession, no trumpet sounds, or lines of nobles dressed in mourning. Instead, FitzRoy's body was taken to Thetford Priory in Norfolk, a religious house associated with his wife's family, the Howards, and there he was laid to rest. No royal tomb, no monument, no crown laid on his chest. A few members of the Howard family may have been present. His young widow, Mary Howard, reportedly did not attend. And the king, the man who once elevated FitzRoy above dukes and barons, did not show his face. Why didn't Henry grieve publicly? Some historians argue that Henry was emotionally devastated, that he couldn't bring himself to attend the funeral, that the pain of losing his only son was too great, that his silence was the silence of a shattered father. Others suggest something colder, that Henry chose silence not out of sorrow, but out of calculation. Remember, FitzRoy was never legitimate, and Henry was preparing to marry Jane Seymour, a woman whose greatest political value lay in her ability to give him a legitimate son. If the public perceived FitzRoy's death as a royal tragedy, it would only reignite questions of succession and legitimacy. It could stir sympathy, unrest, or even dangerous nostalgia. So Henry did what he always did when an inconvenient chapter needed closing. He erased it. Caught in the middle of it all was Mary Howard, FitzRoy's teenage wife. She was now a widow at just 15 years old, and though married to the king's son, she received no lands, no titles, no pension. She returned to her family, a girl who had once been part of England's highest hopes, now relegated to the shadows. Some letters suggest she was deeply affected by FitzRoy's death, not just personally, but politically. She remained loyal to his memory, even as the court moved on. Mary would never remarry. In a way, she became a living monument to FitzRoy's unfinished story. With FitzRoy dead, England's succession crisis deepened. Queen Jane Seymour would eventually give birth to a son, Edward VI, but not until 3 years after FitzRoy's burial. And in those years, England remained on edge. Who would inherit the throne? What if Jane couldn't have children? Would the crown go to a foreign power? Would civil war break out? These questions haunted Henry's advisors, and FitzRoy's death lingered in the background, not as an event, but as a warning. He was the what-if prince, a glimpse of an alternate history that vanished without explanation. Perhaps the most chilling part of FitzRoy's legacy is how intentionally forgettable his death became. When Thetford Priory was destroyed under Henry VIII's own dissolution of the monasteries, FitzRoy's grave was lost. Some believe his remains were moved to Framingham Church, but there is no royal tomb, no official marker, and no monument with his full name and title. The boy who was nearly heir to England has no resting place fit for a king. He vanished not only from power, but from stone, from prayer, from public memory. Centuries later, Henry FitzRoy remains a footnote in most Tudor textbooks, a side character, a line in a family tree, a curious what-if. But the truth is, for several years, FitzRoy was the only viable male heir to one of Europe's most powerful monarchies, and his death, so quiet, so sterile, so politically tidy, still leaves a cold space in the historical record. What did Henry VIII really feel? Why was the funeral so rushed? And what might have happened if FitzRoy had lived? These are questions with no answers, only silence. Henry FitzRoy never ruled. He never issued a royal edict, never led an army, never wore a crown. And yet, his shadow lingers in the pages of Tudor history, not because of what he did, but because of what he could have done. He was a what-if in a time when kings were supposed to be destiny made flesh. He was the son who came too early and died too soon. A flicker of legacy that vanished just before it could catch flame. But the question remains, what if he had lived? What if the boy, raised like a prince, had become a king? Let's imagine that path. Had Henry FitzRoy survived his illness in 1536, the political landscape of England might have shifted radically. The first and most obvious consequence? He would have likely been legitimized. Historians agree that Henry VIII was seriously considering this. As early as 1527, documents were drafted hinting that the king might name FitzRoy his successor. Henry VIII had spent years frustrated by Catherine of Aragon's failure to produce a living son. His trust in the Pope had been shaken. His desperation for dynastic continuity was growing. In FitzRoy, he had a living, intelligent, capable male, one who even resembled him physically. If FitzRoy had lived into adulthood, that legitimacy would have become more than hypothetical. With Anne Boleyn executed and Elizabeth declared illegitimate, FitzRoy would have stood as the most stable choice in a time of deep uncertainty. He had already been married into the Howard family, a powerful political house. He was well educated, fluent in Latin, practiced in diplomacy, and raised within the traditions of kingship. All that remained was a royal decree, and Henry VIII was never shy about rewriting the rules when it suited him. If FitzRoy had become heir, or even king, what would that have looked like? First, the Protestant Reformation in England might have taken a very different turn. FitzRoy was raised Catholic, but not devoutly so. His tutors included humanists and reformist thinkers, and there's evidence to suggest he was open to religious flexibility, likely more moderate than Edward VI, yet more adaptable than Mary was. A FitzRoy monarchy might have led to a hybrid religious state, a kind of soft Anglicanism that kept elements of Catholic tradition without papal control. This might have softened the violence of the Reformation, reduced the burnings under Mary, and avoided the purges under Edward. It might have unified a fractured country, or at the very least, delayed its most brutal divisions. Second, the royal succession crisis of the late Tudor period might never have occurred. FitzRoy would likely have become king before Edward VI was ever born. Jane Seymour may have still produced a son, but the birth would not have had the same dynastic urgency. FitzRoy's reign might have prevented the desperate chain of short, unstable monarchs that followed Henry VIII's death. No child king, no 9-day queen, no reversal between Catholicism and Protestantism, no mass executions of nobles based on shifting loyalties. England might have enjoyed something it had not seen in decades: continuity. Third, the rise of the Elizabethan Golden Age may never have happened, at least not in the form we know. If FitzRoy had lived, Elizabeth may have been forever sidelined. She might have lived out her life as a minor court noble, respected for her intellect but barred from power. There would have been no Gloriana myth, no defeat of the Spanish Armada under a virgin queen, no Shakespearean age of political theatre. But history is not fair in its trade-offs. For every brilliant woman denied a throne, perhaps a country was spared a war. For every lost golden age, perhaps a bloody rebellion was prevented. We cannot know. What we do know is that FitzRoy, had he ruled, would have brought with him the full force of Tudor confidence, but tempered by years of watching how power twists and destroys. Unlike Edward VI, FitzRoy was not sickly from birth. Unlike Mary, he had not been humiliated by being declared illegitimate. Unlike Elizabeth I, he had not seen his mother executed by royal command. He was born into favor, raised in splendor, but shaped by the cautious eyes of a court that both feared and adored him. He was, by all accounts, emotionally balanced, politically shrewd, and socially skilled. A Tudor with potential. A Tudor without trauma. What England might have looked like under such a monarch is a dream historians still revisit, with equal parts admiration and frustration. But all of this is speculation. And history does not deal kindly with speculation. In the real timeline, FitzRoy died at 17. His body was buried without fanfare. His memory was scrubbed from court documents. His name faded from the lips of those who once pledged loyalty to him. Even his young widow, Mary Howard, was quietly forgotten, a relic of a dynastic plan that had failed before it could even be written in stone. And Henry VIII? He never spoke his son's name in public again. He went on to have another son, Edward, who died at 15. Then Mary, who died without an heir. Then Elizabeth, who died childless. The Tudors, for all their brilliance and power, died out within a single century. Had FitzRoy lived, that story might have gone on longer. Had FitzRoy lived, perhaps the Tudor dynasty would have continued beyond a single generation of chaos and contradiction. Had FitzRoy lived, perhaps England would have changed forever. But he didn't. He remains what history hates most, a possibility. There is something deeply human about the silence surrounding Henry FitzRoy. It isn't the silence of a scandal covered up or a crime left unsolved. It's the silence of something once filled with promise that simply ceased to be. No great betrayal, no famous last words, just a slow descent, a quiet burial, and the soft, deliberate closing of a door. He is the prince history almost wrote about, the King England almost had, the legacy that ended before it began. And sometimes that is the most chilling ending of all.